do you say, sir, the intention behind the Turkish allowing the alliance to use the base against ISIL and also the recent airstrikes in Syria and northern Iraq, is it more about domestic politics inside Turkey, or is it more about working with the alliance against the ISIL? Dr. Ali Reza.
I think the domestic factors are more important than the external international considerations. The fact that the United States has been asking Turkey for a very long time to use the air bases in Turkey, particularly Incirlik in southern Turkey, to facilitate attacks on ISIS targets. And Turkey has been rejecting them until now. And it's only decided to say yes at this particular moment after June 7, when the ruling AKP government lost its majority in parliament. I think tells us all we need to know, that it's domestic factors more than anything else that have actually led to this decision.
Mr. Walker, do you agree with that? And do you think Washington understands that well, 100%, just as Dr. Ali Reza just illustrated?
I do agree with that. I think Bulent's 100% right in terms of the timing of this and the fact that domestic factors right now are overwhelming. Of course, domestic factors bleed into foreign factors when it comes to this particular issue. As you've already highlighted, the ongoing Kurdish peace process may be the biggest factor here. But regardless of why it's happening, I think Washington has welcomed this, because Turkey's entrance in a very significant way in terms of militarily striking ISIL for the first time is very significant. Turkey has been part of the coalition from the beginning, but it's mostly been focused on the refugee crisis. So the question now is Turkey going in because they have a genuine interest in defeating the Islamic State, or are they more preoccupied with their traditional enemy, which is the terrorist organization PKK? And I think from a Washington perspective, we're watching very closely to see how facts on the ground play out. But either way, I think Washington's pleased by what's happening.
But you probably have also noticed, Mr. Joshua Walker, that the U.S. has already made a very official statement about this. Quote, the Turkish government has the lawful right to take actions related to terrorist targets both in Syria and in northern Iraq. It seems that Washington is already standing with the Turkish government, no matter what the intention was from the Turkish side, at least recently, to bomb northern Iraq and Syria. Do you think Washington has already taken a very clear stance? Go ahead.
No, I think you're right in the sense that Washington has been very clear about this from the very beginning, that any terrorist organization that threatens Turkey, which is a major ally of NATO, that they'll be having a meeting later on, this is something that Washington will stand beside. What I meant in terms of its complicating factors is that the PKK is only one part of the Kurdish question. There are Kurds in Iraq, there are Kurds in Syria, and there are Kurds in Turkey. And so how that all plays out with domestic Turkish factors is very different than the ones that plays out regionally, which Washington has to pay very close attention to, given that the Kurds in Iraq have been our closest allies, and Kurds in Syria have been the only ones who've been able to militarily defeat the Islamic State so far.
Therefore, going back to you, Dr. Ali Reza, it is complicating the matters because the Kurds, some of them at least, are working with Washington in this global alliance against ISIL. Well, now if Washington is supporting Ankara, at least for these airstrikes, it seems that it could distance some of the Kurdish factors in support about this attacks against ISIL. What do you think about the judgment coming from Washington? And where do you think, sir, given your rich knowledge about Turkey and related issues, where the Kurds would go?
You know, the fact that the United States intensified its negotiations with Turkey after the indecisive election results, we still do not have a government. The coalition talks have not got anywhere, but nonetheless, Washington sent a high-level delegation on July 7th, and President Obama personally called President Erdogan, and the deal was struck. Now, let me note that U.S. aircraft have not started missions from Incirlik yet. The agreement has been announced both in Washington as well as here in Ankara, but it is yet to be implemented. Now, given the Turkish desire to actually prevent the Kurds of Syria from establishing a continuous belt beyond the Turkish-Syrian border, which Turkey does not want, is very much part of Turkey's desire to engage the United States in order to prevent this Kurdish belt from coming into being. and it sees the PYD, which is the Syrian Kurdish party that's been fighting ISIS in northern Syria, as being linked to the PKK, gives us a better understanding of why it is that Turkey is hitting the PKK at this particular moment rather than before. So from Washington's point of view, and as we look at the US-Turkish relationship as it evolves, Washington has to be very careful that it does not seem to be giving Turkey a carte blanche to attack the Turkish Kurds based in northern Iraq, namely the PKK, to effectively prevent the PYD from expanding their territory at the expense of ISIS and other groups in northern Syria, and effectively puts an end to the peace process within Turkey by vilifying the HDP, which did so well in the last elections. And all of those would be major considerations for Washington as we proceed with the implementation of this agreement.
But Dr. Ali Reza, you know it very well, better than I do. You are now in Ankara. Some of the opposition parties, two major ones, are already accusing the Erdogan government of trying to distract the attention inside the country about this political process of coalition talks, and also create some kind of quote-unquote national emergency for an early election so that the Erdogan government could have in a way, a more possible victory than if held later. So what do you say about the Turkish intention and also the Washington's ability to read the Turkish intention if that were the case?
Well, that's precisely the right question to ask. The extent to which Washington is reading the situation right. Now, Washington, in its eagerness to strike this deal, to be able to launch attacks from Incirlik, which would make the bombing of ISIS targets in Syria much easier than before, may have overlooked the domestic factors behind this decision. Now, you talked about the Erdogan government. Technically, it's not the Erdogan government. It's the Davutoğlu government that went into the elections, lost its majority, because Turkey is still a parliamentary system, not a presidential one, even though Mr. Erdogan exercises great influence. It's quite clear that even though Mr. Davutoğlu, who is the caretaker prime minister now, is negotiating with one of the opposition parties, the CHP, led by Mr. Kılıçdaroğlu, for a coalition, Mr. Erdogan, President Erdogan, is not keen on the idea of a coalition government, and he would much prefer to have early elections, what he calls repeat elections, in November. So you're absolutely right in saying that appearing to be the security president at this particular juncture might help him regain the votes for the AKP to continue in government as a single party. But it's a risky policy if that is indeed what his intentions are.
At least some analysts have been saying so. Let me come back to you, Mr. Yan, here in Beijing. How do you see this complicating process already going on in terms of the possible coalition against ISIL? After all, we've also seen very different attitudes coming out of Washington and also from Brussels and also from Germany. They were saying, the two latter ones coming from Europe, saying it has to be proportionately appropriate when dealing with internal issues. That's a direct quote. What do you think about different attitudes toward this issue coming out of Turkey about Turkey strikes in northern Iraq and also Syria?
First point is that I'm doubting that Turkey is really shifting its original position toward Islamic State. Because I think Turkey is taking this as an opportunity to clamp down the PKK problem, and why the United States is so strongly supporting Turkey's position. I think right now the international coalition against the Islamic State is in a stalemate, and after about 1 year of attack, the Islamic State threat is still growing and conquering more territories. So United States right now very urgently need some partner to stand out and to devote more resources to combating Islamic State. So although United States is not very sure about the Turkey's shift in policy, but the United States have to and want to. But if Turkey attack against the Kurdish militant groups is greatly affecting the Kurdistan militants' against the Islamic State, the United States position toward Turkey's policy may change.
Interesting. Shall I go back to you, Mr. Walsh? And therefore, do you think, Mr. Walker, is it likely to shift a lot Washington's stance given what could happen on the ground, particularly the actions between the Kurds militia and also the ISIL?
I mean, I think we have to be very careful here. I think Washington has a large role as a convener and as one that's able to bring the players together. And if Turkey has indeed changed its policy and become a major anti-ISIL threat, that's one thing. But I think we're playing a much longer game here. It's very clear that Washington and Americans do not want to go in with boots on the ground. So if Turkey wants to create this kind of safety zone, as they're calling it, which Washington is very hesitant to call a no-fly zone because of what it would commit us towards, then I think Turkey will be on its own here in terms of putting its own boots on the ground. We've already seen special forces operations in the past. We've seen it in northern Iraq. If they want to do the same things in Syria, I think Washington will be very supportive, but I don't think Washington will be doing everything. I think the question here is, can they coordinate? And the issue here is, will the U.S.-Turkish alliance, will it be able to work together to more effectively combat ISIL and also to combat the PKK, which is so important to Turkey? And the ramifications in the larger region is something that goes beyond just Turkey and the U.S., but includes other partners, including Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and other alliances, including
Before we
NATO.
go to other alliances, do you think, Mr. Walker, yourself, do these two fights, one against ISIL and one against the PKK, in a way or in certain areas conflicting toward one another and therefore make Washington's job ever more interesting and also tightrope walking?
I think that they are simultaneous in the sense that terrorist organizations are terrorist organizations, but you're right to point out that the threat from ISIL is a non-controversial one. Everybody in the region is against ISIL. The PKK has sympathies, and there are many in the Kurdish regions of Syria and Iraq that do not see the PKK as a terrorist organization. There are some within Turkey that do not see this. And so I think the question for Turkey in terms of its emphasis of priority may be slightly different, and Washington will have to balance it very carefully, as we've already talked about.